Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are stepping right into the courtroom to tackle a really fundamental question. When a trial starts, how on earth does a court figure out what actually happened?
Okay, let's dive in with a classic scenario you'd see in any legal drama. We have A on trial, accused of murdering B. The scene is set, the stakes are high.
And right away, we hit the central problem. A trial is just a flood of information. Claims, counterclaims, stories, and data. So the court's number one job is to figure out how to separate the facts that matter from all of that background noise.
To answer that, we first have to understand the different kinds of facts that get presented to a court. Because, not all information is created equal.
So imagine this is all the information the lawyers bring in. You've got a rivalry, someone buying a knife, bloodstains on a shirt. That all seems pretty important, right? But then you see this last one. A stopped to eat noodles. I mean, on the surface, what does that have to do with anything? It feels completely random.
To sort through all this, the court has to focus on what the law calls the fact in issue. This isn't just some vague question. It's the one specific, core legal point the entire case hangs on. For example, did A, with the intent to kill, actually cause B's death with a specific weapon? That's the target.
And that brings us to the first huge filter that the law applies to all that information we saw, the idea of relevancy.
Now here's the key. A fact isn't just relevant in a vacuum. It only becomes relevant if it logically connects to that main question, that fact in issue. So the bloodstains, totally relevant. The rivalry, yeah, that could show motive so it connects. But the noodles? Well, at this point, they seem pretty irrelevant.
But hang on. Watch how a little bit of context can change everything. What if it turns out A was poisoning those noodles, and the plan was to give them to B? All of a sudden, that silly, irrelevant fact about the noodles becomes super relevant to the case. See? Context is everything.
But here is where it gets a little tricky. Just because something seems logically relevant to you and me, that doesn't automatically mean the court is allowed to consider it. The law has its own rulebook.
Under a law like India's Evidence Act, the Sakshya Adhiniyam, this gets split into two categories. First, there's logical relevancy, which is basically common sense. It's a huge, broad category. But then there's legal relevancy, and that's a much smaller, stricter list of things the law officially says are relevant.
A great way to picture this is to imagine a big circle of everything that's logically connected. But inside that big circle, there's a much smaller circle. That's legal relevancy. For a fact to even have a chance of being heard in court, it has to fall inside that smaller, legally approved circle.
So what's actually on this exclusive list? Well, the law is pretty specific. It includes things like confessions, opinions from experts, facts that might show a motive, and sometimes even judgments from past court cases. These are all pre-approved as legally relevant.
Okay, so a fact makes it onto the legally relevant list. But we're not done yet. It still has one more major hurdle to clear before it can officially be called evidence in the trial.
So what you have is this powerful two-step filter. First, the fact has to be legally relevant. It has to be on that approved list. But even if it is, it then has to pass a final test. The judge has to decide if it's admissible.
And that's because the judge is the ultimate gatekeeper. This concept of admissibility is the final checkpoint, and the judge holds the key. They have the final say on what information gets in and what gets kept out.
There's a great old saying in law that sums this up perfectly. All admissible evidence is relevant, but not all relevant evidence is admissible. Think of it this way. Being legally relevant gets you to the courtroom door, but it's admissibility, the judge's decision, that actually lets you inside.
So why would a judge ever reject a fact that's already legally relevant? Well, it's because sometimes other legal principles and ideas of justice are seen as even more important than just that one piece of information.
And a perfect example of this is something called privileged communication. The law basically says that certain relationships, like the one between a lawyer and their client, need absolute trust and confidentiality to even work. So, let's go back to our case. Imagine A sits down with his lawyer and confesses, "I did it. I murdered B." I mean, you can't get any more relevant than that. It's a direct admission of guilt. It's the smoking gun. But this creates a huge dilemma, doesn't it? Do we chase after that truth at all costs, even if it means forcing a lawyer to betray the trust of the very person they are supposed to defend? And here, the law makes a very clear choice. It says, no,
It decides that protecting a person's fundamental right to get confidential legal advice is more important than that one piece of evidence. So, even though the confession is highly relevant, the judge must rule that it is inadmissible. It can't be used.
And this same principle applies in other situations too. For instance, in India, a confession made to a police officer is generally considered inadmissible to help prevent forced confessions. Or, in a totally different kind of case, if a lawyer in a civil trial tries to present evidence way past the deadline, it might be relevant, but the judge will say, nope, too late, it's inadmissible, because procedural fairness matters. So when you boil it all down, what you have is this journey. You start with this chaotic cloud of facts and information, and it has to pass through two critical filters to become official evidence. First, the filter of legal relevancy, and then the final filter of judicial admissibility. And this really leaves us with a final, fascinating question to think about. If the ultimate goal is just to find the truth, why would we ever have rules that hide a relevant fact from a court? I think the answer is that the legal system isn't just a truth-finding machine. It's a complex system that is constantly balancing that search for truth against other fundamental rights and values like fairness, the right to a lawyer, and preventing police misconduct. And it's that balance that truly defines justice itself.